keynote is entitled Sitopia, How Food Can Save the World. So, Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Well, it's lovely to be with you, and I'm sorry we're not there in person, but this is the next best thing. And I guess we're saving the planet by not flying, so there you go. Anyway, I shall share my screen and try indeed to explain why I make this claim that food can save the world, which I actually really do believe it can. Yes, we obviously meet sadly in very perilous times, as I don't have to tell you. We have climate change, a major threat, and also, of course, the pandemic, which is ongoing. And I think it's very easy to get almost kind of frozen in the headlights when we face crises like this. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about food as a sort of medium for actually thinking and acting is that I'm going to argue that food connects both those two things, the virus and climate change, but also everything else major that's going on in our lives that we need to address. And this is me looking similarly disheveled the way I look now. When the first time I held my new book, Sitopia, which Andrea kindly just mentioned, which actually came out the same week that the pandemic was declared. So that sort of felt almost kind of as though it was meant to be in a way. I should explain Sitopia as a word I made up, and it just means food place. And it comes from the Greek word sitos for food and topos for place. And the reason I invented this word, which I probably did about 15 years ago, is that I believe, or not I believe, I mean I have discovered, as it were, that we live in a world shaped by food. We are shaped by food ourselves. In fact, we consist of all the meals that we've ever eaten, and our landscapes are shaped by it, our climate, as we're just discovering, our cities, our habits, our economy, our politics, and so on. So food is this incredibly powerful force shaping our world. And I thought the phenomenon deserved to be named. And in a sense, the reason I've gone for this Greek version of, basically I'm saying we live in a world shaped by food, or a food place, is because I believe we can use food as an alternative to utopia. And I'll explain a lot more about that again later on as well. But basically Sitopia is like a kind of a practical food-based alternative to utopia. Now, I'm going to show you this slightly embarrassing drawing, which I did. It's actually based on an original drawing that I did, which is even less kind of impressive looking, but was the drawing that I did from which the book actually came. As Andrea explained, I'm an architect, so I tend to think spatially. And about 12 years ago, I was trying to sort of think to myself, where does food really sit in our lives? And I sort of sat down and drew a plate of food, and then drew a table around the plate and people around the table, as you can see here, and started drawing arrows between them saying, sharing, communication, and so on. And then there's a kind of cook figure off to the left here. Can you see my arrow, by the way? Sorry, I should have asked you that before. Can you see my arrow? Oh, yes. You can. Cool. Excellent. Thank you. So there's a cook figure. It might be the parent or the mother or the father of the children cooking for them, or it could just be someone who cooks. But, to cook is an act of love, and it implies caring and nurturing somebody. And then I guess if you are cooking for your kids, you would kind of hope that there would be some sort of gratitude coming back in the other direction. But in any case, this kind of process of nurturing, cooking, looking after children is, of course, ultimately the space of the home and the family. But of course, most people don't produce their own food. So where does the food come from? Well, it comes from a market, not necessarily a sort of old-fashioned one like this in the middle of a city with people kind of dressed up in sort of butcher's aprons and stuff. But nevertheless, it comes from some sort of exchange mechanism where food is coming into the city and then being bought. I say the city, obviously not everybody lives in the city, but Basically, as you know, now more people do live in cities globally than in the countryside. And of most major markets and food that is traded in this way, of course, travels in some way through either cities or city-based institutions, and it all gets quite complicated. But anyway, what we're really talking about here is economy. So we're talking about food being traded, and of course, not only food is traded, but food is a major part of what we trade and always has been. And so we see the exchange also of money, trust, and so on, and knowledge, and also competition between the providers of food as well. So, I mean, I'm drawing a very simple diagram to explain something that's actually extremely complex. But I'm trying to sort of paint a picture of the fact that this plate of food in front of you actually has resonances globally. Okay, so the market sits in some way in the city, and of course the city is not self-sufficient because it relies on a place called the countryside to feed it. And of course the countryside itself is a modified version of nature which sits outside the countryside, and that's really the source of all our sustenance. And of course, you know, we are part of nature. So what we're really talking about here is a series of, you know, scales, again, moving out from that plate of food that actually tell us that we are part of nature. And of course, there are cycles, more cycles going on in here, with the city sort of expelling its waste and sucking in nutrients from the natural world. And then the very outer ring of this drawing that I did, I just kind of drew space. Because of course, another really significant thing is that we're on a planet that is, you know, rotating and revolving around the sun and flying through space. And this gives us seasons, and it gives us time, and it gives us day and night, all of which are also very significant because they're all the basis upon which life exists, and of course, therefore, upon which all food is grown. So actually the structure of my book is like a sort of a section drawn all the way through this drawing. So it goes from a plate of food to our bodies, to the home, to the market, the city, the countryside, nature, and then ultimately time. And that's really, that is Sitopia. That is a sort of diagrammatic representation of the fact that we live in a world shaped by food. But what it also is it's a reminder that, you know, every time you sit down to eat, you are eating nature and you are building yourself. And so it connects you directly to the world and also to every other living creature that eats. That's why food is so powerful. So, well, you know, how did we get here, really? I mean, I think, you know, something that's very interesting to contemplate is the question of what it means to eat, you know, and how to eat is obviously a question that every living creature faces. But only humans have kind of turned it into this fantastically complicated kind of quest to, as it were, constantly invent different technologies that make it easier and easier for us to eat and, in a sense, dominate nature more and more. And I think it really is fair to say that we evolved through sort of sharing the problem of how to eat and collaborating to get better at it. And there have been very significant signposts along the way, one of which, I mean, arguably the most significant of which was the discovery of how to control fire, which of course not only allowed our ancestors to modify the landscape, so you can light fires and you can destroy areas of forest, which mean that you create clearings, which bring animals in, which makes them easier to hunt, etc., etc. But also, of course, it meant that we could cook food. And cooking food is incredibly significant in our evolution because basically it meant that our ancestors could specialize in hunting and meat. I mean, of course, meat is a massive issue now because of climate change, but actually meat was the key food that brought, you know, more richer nutrition to our ancestors. And they were able to specialize in hunting because some people would stay back in camps. Some people, by the way, being the women, would stay back in camp, forage for tubers and so on around the fire, and then cook the tubers. So there was a kind of backup vegetarian meal waiting for the hunters in case they were unsuccessful. And of course, everybody would then eat together. So the fact that the hunter-gatherer band was able to support some members to be permanent hunters actually improved the diet for the whole band. And then the shared meal, I think, is also very significant because it becomes really the first the economy, and I would also argue the best economy that humans have ever invented, because food is the most valuable thing in our lives that we have to actually exert effort to get. And so basing your economy on food makes a lot of sense. Anyway, there's so much to say about this, obviously. I have to move on, but you know, I think the relationship as well between ourselves and technology, and how we've evolved through history to evolve different technologies to feed ourselves is massively significant. Now, of course, the question of how to eat also shapes that other major question, which is how to live. And of course, the two things are completely inseparable. So if you are a hunter-gatherer, you don't stay in one place, you follow the food around. And actually, I mean, it's very, very interesting to me that many cultures, not just the Bible, actually represent this sort of pre-agrarian state as paradise. Actually, modern scholars think that the biblical paradise was actually in the ancient Near East, which I'll show you in a minute, because it was a very, very fertile area. But crucially, people basically, as I say, they didn't really stay in one place, because you would eat, you know, pull all the fruit off the trees, not always as faithfully as in this case, and then you would hunt animals, and then when you kind of denuded the food supplies in one area, you would move to another territory and probably only come back a year later or something. So it's a peripatetic existence. People moved around. And here is, as I say, the real life Garden of Eden, which was the so-called Fertile Crescent in the ancient Near East. It's called the Fertile Crescent because, as you can see, it's crescent shaped, and it was very fertile, as I've just said. But interestingly, round about 12,000 years ago, you know, the world actually faced its last major climate crisis, and all the rich forest that did exist in this area began receding northwards. And people started running out of food, so they had to get inventive. And what happened to exist in this territory were the ancient antecedents of modern grains like wheat and barley. And so people started to get a bit, I mean, actually people had eaten grain before, but not in a very systematic way. But now they get very kind of, they start to focus on grain as their source of food. And of course, what you do if you do this is you save the seed, and you plant it in the ground, and then you look after it, which means you don't wander off. So you start to get the evolution of more static settlements around this time up the Mediterranean coast, and also in modern Turkey, ancient Anatolia. Some very, very sophisticated settlements, you know, permanent settlements. Which relied partly actually on farming and partly on still on hunting and gathering. So it's a kind of mixed picture. But eventually a group of static settlements evolved down here at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which gives this region its name, which is Mesopotamia, which means between two rivers, as they flow into the Persian Gulf. And these settlements became complex enough to be considered cities. So what we're really looking at here is the co-evolution of farming and urbanity. And it's, as I say, a very mixed picture. It's not a cartoon again, but essentially over the course of a few thousand years in this area, and then almost at the same time, a bit later in the Indus Valley, you get the evolution of these very, very complex static settlements based on grain, the eating of grain, which of course has the enormous advantage that you can grow a surplus of it, and then it can be very easily stored, and therefore it can feed a large non-food producing population, which is precisely what happened in these early cities. So if I look, you know, show you one of those cities I was just pointing out, which is the city of Ur, you can see several really interesting things. So this whole territory hadn't been excavated at the time. It still hasn't been fully excavated. But if you look at this area that has been excavated, you can see it's very densely populated. That's, oops, sorry. It's, oh, sorry again. My mouse is doing that. Lots of houses very tightly packed together. So it's very, very dense. It's quite small. It's about 0.5 kilometre across. It's on a river, obviously, as I've already mentioned. It's surrounded by farmland, which is irrigated from the river with very complex earthworks that, you know, they basically built levees, which are the first municipal earthworks ever built to control the river water to irrigate and fertilize the farmland. And then interestingly, in the middle, you can see it's dominated by this large temple complex, and the temple actually was the administrative as well as the religious center of the city, and was responsible for bringing in the harvest, which of course was the most important moment in the year, offering the grain to the gods in this famous ziggurat of Ur, which is the house of the gods, storing the grain in this huge granary, temple granary, baking into bread, and then distributing it through the city through the course of the year. So if we were going to ask the question of how did the first cities in the world feed themselves, we'd say they were city-states. In other words, it's a city surrounded by farmland, and in the middle it's dominated by a large, what we would now probably call a large food distribution hub in the form of the temple. Now, this was a very successful model, and it was repeated all over the world. And interestingly, the first people to really systematically ask the question, how do you feed a city, were the Greeks. And both Plato and Aristotle, that's actually Aristotle you're looking at there. They lived in Athens, as you know, and Athens was a polis, and a polis was a city-state. So it was basically combining exactly in the same way, if you look down here, an urban core and a rural hinterland. Now, both Plato and Aristotle were very obsessed with the question of what an ideal city might be like, and as part of that discussion, they asked themselves the question, how would you feed a city? And they both thought that the best way for the city to feed itself was through what they called oikonomia, this word down here, which means household management, and comes from the Greek oikos for household and nemein for management. And the idea was that every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the household. And of course, if every citizen had that arrangement, then the city would be self-sufficient. So Plato and Aristotle were thinking, okay, well, if this is going to work, the city actually has to remain fairly small, because obviously the bigger it gets, the harder it's going to be for all the citizens. You know, geometry will make it very difficult for all the citizens to have a farm that's close enough that they can ride out each day and sort of supervise it and stuff. And this is all, by the way, happening on the basis of slave labor, in case that's not clear. So the citizens are not doing their own farming. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting, a very powerful idea that the city and the countryside are in this kind of partnership. And I think there's another sort of a phrase of Aristotle's that I find really interesting in this respect, which is that he talks about humans as political animals. And I love this phrase because it sort of sums up a kind of duality in humanity, which is that, you know, we are social beings or political beings, which means we need society. That's actually the Athenian agora you're looking at there, arguably the greatest public space ever constructed, which is sort of part food market, part political space, part sort of religious site. That was the heart of the city, but also we're animals, which means we are part of nature and we need to dwell in nature. So the question really is, how do you bring these two things together? And of course, you know, again, both Plato and Aristotle thought the way to do this was through keeping the city small and practicing oikonomia, or household management. If oikonomia sounds vaguely familiar, by the way, as a word, it's because, of course, it's the basis of our modern word economics. Ironically, because, of course, what it represents is pretty much the exact opposite of what modern economics are, which is the making of money for its own sake, which Aristotle warned against, because he said there was no natural balance in that. This is my favorite image, really, to describe what Aristotle's talking about. As some of you might know it, it's a wonderful image. If you don't know it, I really recommend you either go to Siena, which is where it is. It's in the city hall on one huge wall. I mean, this thing's probably about, you know, 20 meters wide. It's huge. And as you can see, what it represents is the city itself in relationship with the countryside. And of course, you know, it was painted in the 14th century. This is the moment when sort of cities are really resurging in Italy, and we get the evolution of the Italian city-state, which is actually the next major phase of the city-state per se, and this recognition of the importance of the relationship between the city and the countryside. And there's just so much fascinating detail in this image, but just if you look, the more closely you look at it, the more you can see it's all about food. You know, so obviously this is a very highly modified landscape. It's not a natural landscape, it's actually countryside. It's modified landscape, which has kind of been adapted to feed the city. So you've got olive groves, vineyards, wheat fields, and so on. Everyone's working in it very industriously. And you know, out of the city, you can see, you know, huntsmen leaving to go and maybe shoot a deer or something. So you've got asses with grain on their backs arriving, a pig being walked to market. Inside the city, you can see a flock of sheep being driven around, a woman with a basket of eggs on her head, and so on. So you can see that this red wall in the middle of the image, which appears to be a barrier, is actually a membrane through which trade, people, animals, and critically food are passing back and forth all the time. So if you look at the title of this image, The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, I find that again very significant. So this is, as I say, sitting in the city at the town hall, the main council chamber, and it's really telling the councillors sitting there, this is your job. Your job is to maintain this relationship between the city and the countryside, and that is what good government looks like. Now, once you've seen that, I think, you know, it's like a penny drops. You think, oh, that's really obvious. Of course, there has to be this kind of relationship between the city and the countryside. So why is this such an unusual image? Why is there no other image like it? And that's a really, really interesting question. I mean, and I have my answers to it, but I think that the main reason is that it's been very rare in history that you've had this kind of balance between the city and the countryside. Normally, the city is totally dominant, as it indeed it is today, and that's a problem. Now, why is the city dominant? Well, one reason is, of course, that not all cities have remained small. And the first city to really buck the trend was, of course, famously Rome. And actually, at this point, I normally like to have, gosh, I've taken a hell of a lot of time already, and I'm not very far in the talk. But I normally like to have a little quiz at this point to say, how do you think the city fed itself? But if you just imagine to yourselves, try and work out how a city of 1 million citizens, incredible size for the time, might have fed itself in the ancient world. And I'll give you the answer. Food miles. Now, food miles we often think of as a modern phenomenon, of course, but they're not. So we look at Rome here, it's in the Mediterranean. The way it actually managed to feed itself was by conquering various countries, so Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage famously, and Egypt even more famously, all of which are beautiful grain producing regions. If you remember that grain is the food of cities, as we saw earlier. And it was able to import the grain by sea. Now, it was about 50 times cheaper to move food over the sea than over land. And this is why Rome was able to grow so big, because it was able to bring its food in from a very long way away, hence the food miles. And of course, it wasn't just importing grain, it was importing wine, oil, liquamen, which is a kind of special sort of fermented fish sauce that the Romans were obsessed with. And even oysters, fresh oysters from Britain at a certain point. So you see something really remarkable actually in this map, because what you see is that for the first time, the capacity of one city and its appetite to dominate a territory hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. And it happens in the ancient world, and it happens later actually with Peking, the ancient, the medieval capital of China, about 1,000 years later. So what we're seeing is the beginning of the imbalance between the city and the countryside evolving here. Now, it's very interesting to analyze the productive hinterland of the city, and so that, you know, basically the countryside, and to see how it naturally evolves around a city. And the first person to do that sort of, again, systematically was a German called Johann von Thünen, who in 1826 wrote a book called The Isolated State. And The Isolated State is a fictional country. It's a flat featureless, fertile plain, inhabited by logical, profit-seeking farmers. And then von Thünen sort of dumps an imaginary city in the middle of this territory and says, how would the productive hinterland naturally evolve? And he says, well, clearly around the city you would have market gardening. Why? Because fruit and vegetables are their luxury food, so the farmers can afford the high land rent. And they're very difficult to transport because they go off, so you want them near the city. And also the farmers can make very good use of human and animal manure, which was known as night soil, which was collected because it's very precious, because obviously fertilizer, and dumped on the land around the city. So you've got a little ecological loop going on right around the city. Then there's a band of up to about 30, 40 kilometers of mixed production, but all the grain for the city is grown within this region. The reason for this is that although grain is the most important food of the city, it's the staple food of the city, it's very heavy and bulky in relation to its value. So it's actually very difficult. It's uneconomic to transport it very far. So basically this limits the size to which the city can grow. And then the outer band consists of livestock farming, because of course the animals can walk into markets, so they can actually be bred hundreds of miles away from the city and provide their own transport. And they arrive in the city and they're fattened up in the suburbs and then obviously slaughtered in the city. And the only concession actually that Jan von Thünen made to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then all of those bands could stretch a lot further away, because of course you can then bring the grain to the river and bring it in by water, which is much easier and cheaper. And of course, is in practice what actual cities did. Now, this is all very kind of abstract. It gets much more interesting when you actually apply it to real places. So again, I have a little quiz usually at this point, but I'm just going to again ask you to think, imagine what you can see as a key difference between these two images. You're looking at London and Paris, round about the turn of the sort of late 18th, early 19th century. And you'll see the main river ports of both of those cities. And I'm wondering if you can spot a key difference between them. Just have a think, and I'll tell you. Okay. The difference is that on the left in London, you've got ocean-going ships. So the Thames is a navigable river, as Justus von Thünen was saying. On the Seine, you do not see this because the Seine was not navigable, because Paris was too far from the sea. And this has profound implications. And I can go on for 20 minutes about this, but I won't now today, but just to say that it's not non-accidental that London evolved a free trade attitude to feeding itself, whereas Paris evolved this very hierarchical, centralized way of feeding itself, imposing its will on the countryside. And we know how that ended up. Actually, not long after this image is painted, the city ran out of food, and of course that led to revolution. So here we see also the relationship between food and politics, which is extraordinarily interesting and important. Now, if we look at London, as I say, the Thames was a navigable river, and I've just sort of coloured in these maps of London to show how the food is actually coming into the city. So top left, we can see that's the uncoloured map. You can just see all the market gardens surrounding the city that von Thünen talked about, and every pre-industrial city had this. Then on top right, you can see the grain is obviously mostly coming in by river because it's, as I said, much easier to transport in that way. A little bit coming in by road as well. But it's coming to the two main river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate. It's trying to get up to Cornhill. You can tell by the name, corn is obviously grain. That's where it was traded in London. At the main market, actually the site of the old Roman Forum, interestingly. So markets very rarely move once they're established in cities. And of course, Bread Street was where it was kind of traded on the way up to Cornhill. So you can see that food is physically flowing through the city and shaping it as it goes. Bottom left is fish. And again, sorry, Queenhithe and Billingsgate, obviously, of the main river ports, but they're also obviously therefore the main fish markets as well. And again, you can see from the street names, if you can just make that out, that says Fish Street, and that says Friday Street. Friday Street is where you went to buy fish on a Friday, because the eating of meat was forbidden, which was a big thing in Christian cities all over Europe, that basically because meat was a luxury food that was in short supply, many cities forbade the eating of it on a Friday to reduce the demand, basically. And then, of course, the bottom right, you have meat. And as I said earlier, the animals are walking into the city. They're not coming in by river. A lot of them coming from Scotland and Wales, sort of into the north west of the city. And they gather in a smooth field outside the city, which becomes Smithfield, which is still London's meat market today, after more than 1,000 years trading on the same site. So we've seen from Rome how a city can shape a landscape a long way away from itself. And now we're seeing how food itself actually shapes cities in the pre-industrial era. And in fact, if we look at Smithfield, when it's still a livestock market, it's a remarkable place. There would be up to 10,000 animals here just in the week before Christmas. So unbelievably crowded, chaotic, noisy. Of course, all the animals themselves had to be slaughtered, and that was unregulated completely. And they were just slaughtered in the houses around the market. So it's a really horrifying place, actually, in many ways, and brilliant description of it in Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens's novel, if you're interested. But I call it necessary chaos because, of course, the city has to eat. And therefore, you know, if you lived in the 19th century city, you would not have not known where your food came from because you could literally see it. It was a living creature and walking in front of your window shortly before it was killed, so you could eat it. So the relationship between people and food was very clear. Now, literally 1 year after that image you just seen, the first commercial railway was built, also in the UK, the Liverpool to Manchester Railway. And I find this image really fascinating because actually the railway was built to transport coal from Liverpool to Manchester, the port of Liverpool, to the burgeoning industrial city of Manchester. But look who else is hitching a ride. And what we see here is that, you know, this is the moment, I call this slide Goodbye Geography, because it's the moment when the relationship between cities and geography that I've been more or less endlessly talking about now for at least half an hour, stops. And we start to see a split. So 3 key things happen at this point. The first is that cities can now expand exponentially because it's now possible for the first time to transport food rapidly over long distances. So this destroys the problem of how to feed the city. It doesn't destroy it, actually, it just changes it, but it makes it much easier to bring the food in. Secondly, food becomes invisible because animals are no longer going to walk into the market because they're now going to be slaughtered outside the city and they're going to come in as dead meat. And last but not least, politicians, who until this point have been responsible for feeding the city, they kind of wipe their collective brow and think, thank goodness I don't have to do this anymore. And they cede responsibility to the burgeoning food industries. And these are 3 massive, massive issues that we're still basically facing today. So this just shows you graphically what happens to London as an example. When the railways come, there it is in 1840, barely bigger than the medieval city, very rapidly developing into this kind of, you know, what Patrick Geddes, the father of regional geography, called a sort of ink blot, you know, this vast metropolitan sprawl that you couldn't possibly feed from just 1 or 2 little markets in the centre. And of course, as cities are transformed, so is the countryside that feeds them. So this is what happens in the American Great West, you know, which is a sort of grassland grazed by bison, up to 60 million, it's estimated. And of course, Native Americans who cohabited with them. The bison is slaughtered, not much is done with them because the whole point is to create this enormous, unprecedented area of grain production. So this really is the world's first grain glut. There's more grain than people can eat. And if you think to yourself, what do you do with grain when there's more of it than you can eat? I'm sure you'll come up with the right answer. Feed it to animals. So this is really the beginning of the industrial meat production, which of course is such a huge issue now. It's the invention of cheap meat. And of course, feeding grain to cows is crazy because A, we could eat the grain directly and feed 10 times as many people if we did. But secondly, it makes the cows sick. So you have to pump them full of antibiotics. But nevertheless, this was hugely popular. We are as I think if you remember, think back to the hunter-gatherers I was talking about at the beginning, unfortunately, we are programmed to want it, to desire meat and eat meat, because it's a very, very high value food. So that makes this whole business of trying to eat more sustainably quite difficult. Now, there were immediately obvious problems with this whole way of farming and eating. The first was this, that basically if you change an area of grassland to an area of monocultural grain production, you're totally changing the soil structure. So the roots of the grass that used to be perennially there was about 20 meters deep. So the soil was unbelievably rich, and it was very stable, and it could hold moisture, and it was kept fertile by the bison, who nibble it down to keep the grass healthy, stamp it with their hooves, and then poo on it to fertilize it. So that's a natural ecosystem that keeps grasslands stable. But if you just use that soil and just plant grain crops every year and plow the earth, it gradually loses its moisture and its structure, and eventually, catastrophically, in the 1930s, after a series of dry summers, the whole topsoil of this vast area in the American Midwest just blew away, and you had desertification, major catastrophe. And this really was the beginning of a debate that still rages today about how we're going to farm. Are we going to do it industrially? Are we going to do it organically? And I've just put these two figures here because in a way they represent the two arguments. On the left, you've got Justus Liebig, who was a brilliant German chemist who was the first to work out that the main nutrients that plants need are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which is NPK. There isn't enough nitrogen in the soil usually. It's because most of the nitrogen in the world, which is the most important nutrient for plants, is in the atmosphere. And another couple of also brilliant German chemists, Haber and Bosch, came up with a process of artificially fixing nitrogen, which means using this very complex process, they mimicking lightning strikes, which allows you to basically fix, as it's called, atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into ammonia, which is the basis of all nitrogenous fertilizers. And then that allows you to dump chemical fertilizers on the land, which allows you to grow in this very unnatural way endless monocultural crops. And of course, that is what the whole industrial farming paradigm is based on. But as we know, this is not natural. And of course, if you don't have a sort of full biosystem, you start getting problems with pests and herbs. And of course, then you chuck more chemicals on there, which are also poisons. And the whole thing is basically a mess. And I could go on at some length about this, but clearly not at the time I've got. Anyway, on the other hand, you had Albert Howard, who's a brilliant English agronomist who went out to India. And he actually studied the way the farmers were farming out there and worked out that they were working with the soil. And it's a completely different paradigm. It's actually not ploughing and leaving plants in the ground and allowing the plants to form these what are known as mycorrhizal connections with soil fungi, which is like an underground nutrient market. So the plant feeds sugars to the soil fungi, and the soil fungi, which can get nutrients directly from the rocks and the minerals in the soil, which is where all the micronutrients that plants and we need come from, and they do a swap. So this is the basis of plant health, and of course, because we eat plants, our health. And so these are the two paradigms. Anyway, actually, Howard was winning that argument, and then unfortunately this happened. And of course, during war, the whole thing is, grow as much food as you can, as quickly as you can. And in fact, farmers were literally told to pull up all their hedgerows and grow monoculturally using chemicals. And it's really the beginning of the massive takeover of the industrial model in the West, which of course is now sort of increasingly going across the world. People like Bill Gates are obsessed with making Africa farm in this way, for example. So that was a little diversion into the whole kind of how do we produce the food sort of question, which of course is a parallel but very critical and critically connected question. If we just come back into the city for a moment after the war, interestingly in America, what happens, I've talked about how railways transform cities. Of course, now we have the arrival of the motor car, and these bizarre sort of suburban, I mean, this is sprawl on top of sprawl, you know, suburbia, where nobody in their right minds walks anywhere, you have to drive. And of course, you don't walk to a market, you drive to a supermarket, which is outside the city, which of course is much more effective for food producers because they can just bring the food in directly. And we're now talking food logistics, basically. And everybody's very happy because they walk around in this beautiful air-conditioned space. But the food itself is denatured in order to withstand this kind of weird sort of journey it now has to go. And it's really the beginning of our modern relationship with food, which is depersonalized because the food sells itself directly to you from a packet. It's highly processed to withstand the weird logistics it's got to go through. And we don't really know what to do with it. So she's just popped out for a pint of milk and she's come back with all this stuff, and you know, half of it's going to go off in the fridge. There are other problems to do with the fact that food is no longer reaching people. So if you have a food system that is no longer sort of designed and managed by politicians, or leaders, but by the market, then it obviously goes where the money is, and we start to see food deserts. So this is a very interesting map of New York that was done recently. That's Manhattan, so that's the posh bit around, that's Central Park, so obviously plenty of food there. But the red areas in the Bronx and the Harlem, for example, are poor areas, but they're areas of food desert, which basically means that you have to walk more than 500 meters to get any fresh food at all. So people in these areas are subsisting on crisps and Coke and stuff like that. And so you start to get this modern invention, which is being overweight and undernourished at the same time, which is a historical first. And of course, this is like the opposite of Lawrence City, which is where we are now. Sorry, London seems to be a year behind. But you know, most of the food that feeds us in modern Western cities has often come from the other side of the world. We've got no idea where it comes from. It often comes from highly artificial landscapes like this one on the right. Of course, in Brazil, there's the whole issue of deforestation to create, this is actually a soy field. And of course, most soy goes to feed animals and not us. So it's a completely hopeless system. And I call it the urban paradox, because of course, if you think back to Aristotle, this is the relationship we have to resolve, because it's about us needing society and us needing nature. But how do we bring these things together? And at the moment, they really couldn't be further apart. And I mean, just to make the point that, you know, we've built our modern lives, our modern idea of a good life around the idea of cheap food, but actually there is no such thing as cheap food. And if you look at some of the externalities of the way we eat now, there it's very clear. So we have about a third of global arable land either lost or degraded because of this kind of industrial farming. As you probably know, about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food and farming. We're using up vast amounts of fresh water, farming, you know, irrigating land in the wrong places where we shouldn't be, you know, trying to produce, you know, green beans in the middle of the desert, for example, in Egypt, which is bonkers. So we're running out of fresh water. The phenomenon I just talked about, the fact that we can be overweight and undernourished at the same time. And of course, you know, there's about 800 million people globally who don't have enough to eat. COVID is also an externality of the way we farm. Sorry about this mouse phenomenon. Because of course, COVID made the jump from the natural world to our world because we've reduced biodiversity in our world. And of course, the reduction in biodiversity is a huge issue. There's a massive decline in insect and bird life around farmed areas. And that's, many people are now saying that we're entering a sixth mass extinction. Of course, we waste a lot of food because we don't value it. We're feeding grain to animals, about a third of the harvest. We're spending about 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food we consume. So if you internalize all of these into the food we eat, it would not be cheap. And indeed, it is not cheap. And in fact, my argument, in a sense, is that the fact that we don't value food is literally the single biggest thing that we need to turn on its head in order to start saving the world through food rather than destroying it through food. Now, on top of this, of course, we've got COVID, which just shines a really interesting light on all the things I've already been talking about. So some of you may have seen this in India. during the first lockdown, there were 47 million Indians who were living and working in cities, but whose real home was in the countryside. So you saw this mass exodus. And so it shows the incredible imbalance that exists in India between the city and the countryside. I've already talked about this, deforestation, encroaching on wilderness where we shouldn't be, and also the lack of biodiversity in our world, which is allowing pathogens to make the jump into our world. Social inequality, I just thought this was an extraordinary image from Bangkok, where all the delivery drivers are sort of waiting, socially distanced, waiting to take food to people who can afford to stay at home. And in the UK, and I'd be interested to hear whether this happened where you are as well, but we relied on Romanians to pull our harvest out of the ground basically, and when they were locked down and couldn't come, our fruit just rotted in the fields because we don't harvest our own food anymore, and that's again a symptom of the degree to which we don't value food. And unfortunately, this model of industrial farming, highly processed food, is going global because, of course, the food companies are now much more powerful than governments, and governments rely on them. So we've really totally lost control of the food system at the moment. And this is where things are heading, which is where we need it not to head. So it's a kind of crisis moment, obviously. And as I said at the beginning, the scale of the crisis we face can be really scary and difficult to contemplate. And I love food as a sort of medium for addressing them, because as I say, we have to eat. And as I showed you at the beginning, actually every plate of food that you eat has impacts around the world on not only nature, but also people, many, many thousands of people who feed each of us individually. But I mean, I think in terms of where we're actually heading, this is a wonderful question to ask. Cedric Price, an English architect, said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think it's really important we ask this now. I mean, we're entering what I call a neo-geographical age. So I said, goodbye geography when the trains came. I think we have to say hello geography again. We now know that we're living on a finite planet. We have to be much smarter about the way we use resources. We have to balance our relationship with nature. And of course, this is all down to technology. We're here because of technology and because of the technologies we've invented. But we've forgotten that technology is not an answer in itself. It's in the service of something. And what it's in the service of is that question of what is a good life, which of course brings us back to utopia and the question that people have been asking for thousands of years, which is, how do we live? How do we balance our needs for society and nature? And of course, how do we, in an urban society, how do we balance these in terms of the relationship between the city and the countryside? And I think it's really interesting that in all of these utopian models, so Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, Thomas More's Utopia, and Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities model, they're all really saying the same thing, which is that you have to keep the city small and you have to surround it with countryside. And interestingly, Ebenezer Howard, who really, I mean, his garden city model is like Thomas More's utopia with railways, because Thomas More just said, go back to the city-state, but have a network of city-states so you can walk from one to the other within a day. And Howard, writing hundreds of years later after the railways come, sort of really just puts railways in between all those cities. So he's saying you don't limit the sort of the capacity of society to have something like a symphony orchestra, which needs lots and lots of people, a density of population, because you can connect them up with this modern form of transport, but you can still have a world in which people have easy access to society and to nature if you limit the size of the city. Now, I mean, this again, as I said at the beginning, this is why I invented the word Sitopia, because it's a sort of play on utopia, because utopia itself is a joke word because it means a good place, but also no place. So it's an ideal place that can't exist. And I'm arguing that actually, if we think through food, use food as our multidisciplinary lens for asking the question, what is a good life, we can get close to utopia through food. How do we do that? Well, As I showed you at the beginning, food shapes every aspect of our lives. It's like this kind of constant cycle going, you know, joining us to the countryside and to nature. So if you take any stage of food's journey, you know, we have choices. You know, that's a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO, so that's lots and lots of cattle, tiny little specks being fed on grain, getting sick. Or do we let cows eat grass, which is what they obviously naturally do, and which is why we co-evolved with them? Do we leave the city in order to, you know, in the name of efficiency, or even order our food online? Or do we actually physically go into the city, into a physical space, and meet humans? So use food as a way of animating the city. Do we just, you know, slug food down as fuel? I mean, one of my favorite statistics from before COVID was that 1 in 5 meals in America was being eaten in a car, which just makes you wonder, you know, where we're going. Or do we take time for food? Do we sit down and share it and talk and turn it into a pleasure? And really all of these choices then feed into this kind of filter, if you like, that then ends up with a conception of what might look like a good life. And that's the way up it's got to be. So the question is not, how are we going to feed the world? The question is, what is a good life? What might a good life that, you know, is available to everyone look like in essence? And then what food system would help and support and allow that life? I think it's about value. As I said earlier, I think it's literally the single most important thing we can do is revalue food again. So understand the true value of food, which is the most important thing in our lives. It's very ironic to me that it's usually during a crisis that people do this. So, you know, in London during the war, in Havana after the fall of the Soviet Union, in Detroit after the cars left, the first thing people started doing was growing their own food again, because they had to. So that's obviously bad conditions. We don't want to be forced to grow food. But actually, if you do grow food, it turns out it's quite fun. And it brings you together, and it sort of creates networks, as it has done in places like Detroit. So there's something in this, I think. And of course, COVID is the latest crisis when the same things happened. People have, and I do realize, by the way, that this has been very middle class. You know, you have to have a nice house with a nice garden and be able to work from home for any of this to happen. But, you know, people have discovered neighborliness. They started cooking their own bread. They discovered how lovely it is to cook with their kids again. New local food networks have sprung up. People have got really interested in growing their own food. Now, the thing is, as I say, this is a very middle class thing, but actually it's only middle class because most people don't have the wherewithal to do this. I'm actually arguing, because weirdly, all of these things were things I was arguing for in my book before COVID. This is part of the good life we need to be moving towards, is a world in which people have more time, they have more contact with food, with neighbors. It's a more regional, seasonal, locally based world. And they have, obviously, you know, the home becomes a more important unit again within a broader society. How do we get there? Well, I mean, one of the things we've got to do is address the incredibly monopolistic food system that we've currently got, which looks like this. This is just a study done of 6 European countries a few years ago that found that, you know, 3 million farmers were, as it were, separated from 160 million consumers by just 110 supermarket buyers. So there's an incredible monopoly here, because these people have to eat and these people are producing their food. So what we need is a system that looks more like this, where the roots and the branches connect directly, which means the trunk is still there, but it's less powerful, it's not monopolistic. And of course, that is ultimately what the food movement actually does. So things like co-producing, which is Carlo Petrini's favorite term. Carlo Petrini is the founder of the slow food movement. It means, you know, producers and consumers actually get together. That might be at sort of markets like this one in Kenya, which sadly has just been shut down, but it's a very sort of social space where farmers come into the middle of the city. Could be with what's called community supported agriculture, where, and this, like this one just outside Chicago, where city dwellers actually come out and work with the farmers and actually pay the farmers in advance to feed them. So it's much more collaborative. It's maybe about small-scale farmers farming co-ops, so that they have more clout and more power in the food system, and they start to have a voice. or it's sort of institutions like this, the food court in Singapore, where there's a city institution that actually allows small scale food companies. These are mostly farmers and food related families who have tiny food businesses, but within this bigger institution. And there are many, many of these sorts of models. I think it's about thinking through food when we imagine how we're going to inhabit space, and of course making space for food in the city. So this is now a thing, it's called food planning. And of course, you know, some of you may have seen this enormous new rooftop farm in Paris. You know, it's incorporating food into regional government, making space for things like farmers markets, preserving necessary infrastructure like local abattoirs, creating spaces, social spaces for food like this goods shed in Canterbury, which is part farmers market, part cafe, etc., part shop. And of course, you know, growing food in the city, for example, with vertical farms. There's an amazing revolution going on in agriculture at the moment. I mean, that dichotomy I was describing earlier between industrial and organic, it's really the organics coming back very, very strongly. And there's this new idea of what's called regenerative agriculture, which is basically disrupting that kind of industrial model and sort of saying monoculture is not nature, we have to farm with nature and not against it. So for example, agroforestry, which is planting trees in fields, which brings all sorts of benefits, shade, better water retention, nitrogen fixing, and so on. Maybe mimicking forests in the way that we produce food in forest gardens like this one, which would imply transitioning from a kind of grain and meat based diet towards kind of more nuts and berries and that sort of thing. Mob grazing, which is basically, I mean, radically reducing the amount of meat we eat, but nevertheless, when we do eat meat, making it part of again, a sort of ecological system that mimics what the bison used to do on the grassland, which is basically keeping, you know, animals as part of a sort of ecosystem are extremely valuable, and they really play an important part in processing nutrients and keeping the soil fertile, and of course, you know, providing a very high quality food. And there's the methane question, of course, but actually if we eat a lot less meat, that gets offset by sort of carbon sequestering in the soil. And no-till, which is basically not ploughing, which is getting a huge amount of interest in the moment, because again, then you get all the benefits of a living soil. So at a regional level, it's about bringing the city and the country together. I'm nearly at the end, by the way, in case you're panicking. 2 more slides. So Patrick Geddes, I mentioned earlier, he was the one who talked about the metropolitan splurge. He said what we actually have to do is preserve countryside. So when cities grow, they grow in star shapes, and then you get this big interface between the city and the countryside. Got architects in the UK, for example, Bernard Viljoen, who are saying we have to sort of join up available territory in the city and make it productive again, so you get these fingers of countryside coming into the city. Or studies like this one done in New York saying what is the latent productivity of the city's region and how can we reconnect it to the city. Or master plans like this one by MVRDV, where they're saying how can we incorporate food into a sort of a future urban area in Almere in the Netherlands. So it's maintaining that urban-rural balance that I talked about with Aristotle and Plato. It's bringing back oikonomia, basically. And of course, it's changing the economy to make it more food-based as well. So what does that really look like? Well, again, it's happening already all over the world. So actually that is the plan for Almere. It's actually being built at the moment. This is Brooklyn Grange Farm, a rooftop farm in New York, sort of bringing food production into the city. This is a sort of food-based project in Antwerp called Pact, where they've got food growing, community food growing, commercial food growing, farmers markets, food-related businesses. There's a whole kind of ecosystem evolving that's something like the old-fashioned kind of mixed market. And then, of course, all sorts of schemes that are sort of saying, how can we bring back that sort of the von Thunen, you know, market gardening outside the city and so on. I call these landscapes for human and non-human flourishing because I think that's what we have to get to. I think that's what Steel-Sitopia actually looks like, is a landscape for human and non-human flourishing. Because if we think through food, what we really think is what our relationship with nature is, and how we can flourish alongside our fellow humans, but also our fellow non-humans, without which there is no flourishing. So it's about seeing the world through food, using food as a lens or whatever. And basically saying, a good society is one in which everybody eats well, because all living creatures have to eat. And if we bear that in mind, and if we share food with all our friends and family, but also with people we don't know, and say they must be able to eat well too, and they need the space to do it, and therefore we need land reform actually, and we need wealth reform. I mean, this is actually a revolutionary idea, but that's where it naturally leads you. Because that's what a good society looks like, is one in which everybody eats well, which goes back to our origins, in fact, as hunter-gatherers, when we first learnt to share and to talk and to, love one another around the fire. That's Steel-Sitopia. Thank you very much. If you want to know more, it's all in here.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's been a really, really interesting talk and overview of our connection to food, actually. Okay, so now we have this Q&A session for approximately half an hour, maybe a little bit less. And I would like to invite our audience to raise their hands, the virtual hand, and maybe to switch on their cameras and maybe to ask you questions directly. Or alternatively, you can actually put your question in the chat box and I will read it out loud. And I can see that Ego Müller already posted something. And he asked, we do have choices, you say. This is true, but who is we? And how do we get the we who shape choices to make the right choices for large-scale food production, Carolyn? Yeah. And thank you for your talk.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant question. I mean, almost the most important question. And thank you so much for asking it. Yeah, who are we? I mean, that's just, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? I mean, when I was writing my book, actually, I kept sort of in my head thinking, who is we? Who is we? And actually, who is we kept changing, because sometimes we is we in the West, sometimes we was we in Britain, sometimes we was we human beings, sometimes we was we earthlings, and it's a really important question. I mean, I think one of the things that really interests me, and I didn't talk about it actually as much as I normally, well, no, I mean, not as much as I normally would, but I mean, as much as I'd like to, given even more time, but, the relationship between food and power. So I did allude to it a few times. So if you go back in time, and I'm actually really interested in this, if you go back to our hunter-gatherer origins, actually, I mean, hunter-gatherer societies, I mean, not all of them, but actually quite a lot of them are the most egalitarian societies ever created. Because actually it's a very collaborative thing. If you're living in a band of 30 people, and everyone has to eat every day, you have to defend yourselves against, wild animals and occasionally other hunter-gatherers. It's very, very collaborative, and it's very interesting that hunter-gatherers have this, a lot of them have this kind of society where basically the best hunters, who are obviously the most important people because they're bringing in the best food, are ruthlessly ridiculed by everybody else in the tribe because they don't want them to get too big for their boots, So this is really interesting. So food and power at the beginning is consciously kept sort of collaborative, if you like. We then get into the agrarian societies. Again, I showed you the city of Ur, where the temple was organizing the food system. Well, that's the beginning, if you like, of political leaders taking control of the food system and of power. And actually, it's very interesting that by controlling the harvest, they assumed power. So actually controlling food is power. Which I think is a point, again, I tried to make later on when I was talking about the railways, and I was saying, what happened with the railways is that politicians hated being in control of the food system. By the time you get to sort of 18th century France, for example, and again, I didn't tell the whole story because that would have taken another 20 minutes. But, you know, as you know, the king, or maybe as you don't know, the king in France was responsible for feeding Paris. He was actually known as the baker of last resort. So when the harvest failed, which they did in the 1780s, he was held responsible. And you know what happened to him? You know, so this is why politicians hate being in control of food. So when the railways came, they just went, as I said earlier, don't have to worry about this anymore. So who controls the food system now? Not politicians. It's the food companies, and they are global and they are huge. And you've got Nestle and you've got Monsanto and you've got agri-food and you've got all these huge mega food companies who feed us. And what are the politicians doing? The politicians are taking backhanders from them to keep things the way they are, because politicians don't want to be responsible for food. Politicians hate telling us how to eat and what to eat, because nobody likes being told what to eat or how to eat. And it's kind of lose-lose as far as the politicians are concerned, because basically they want to keep food cheap, because cheap food is a vote winner. So they're actually caught in this kind of dilemma between, you know, sort of, and it's happening in the UK at the moment because we idiotically voted to leave the European Union. So we're now floating off on our own. We've got food shortages, food prices are going up. You know, it's a politician's nightmare, but they brought it on us. I mean, they lied to us. They made people, I mean, I did not vote for Brexit, by the way, but anyway. So anyway, I'm just saying it's really complicated, and you ask a brilliant question. You know, really, who we is should be, I mean, at the global scale, it's humans. At the global scale, we have a massive problem, the question of how we're going to sort of live well on the planet without destroying it in the next century, obviously. Now, we lack global structures that have the power to really deal with the problems like this. So, for example, we've got the United Nations, which is fantastic. You know, it does great work. But, you know, China can just go, nah, not interested. You know, no, I'm not going to, we're going to build 700 coal stations or whatever. You know, I mean, it's just, so that is a real problem. You know, I think in a certain way, I mean, I would say, you know, the actors that we've got, sorry, this is you asked a question, I'm trying to answer it, but it's a big one and it's complicated. You know, we have, what actors do we have? We have civil society, we've got, you know, formal politicians, and we've got, you know, corporations, or if you like, the food industry. Clearly, all of us have a part to play in this, you know, and I think, I mean, one of the most positive things I can say to you is that, you know, I've noticed in the last, I mean, I've been banging on about this food thing now for 20 years. You know, when I started, everyone kind of went, you know, you're an architect, why are you talking about food? And they literally, and I remember somebody actually saying to me at a party about 20 years ago, they said, you're writing a book about food and cities. What have food and cities got to do with each other? You know, and I kind of, well, you know, they have to eat. Now, nobody would say that. So I think, you know, the visibility of food is really increasing, which is fantastic. We've got people like, you know, Greta Thunberg, who is an amazing sort of voice for sort of actually taking this stuff seriously. And she's almost creating a new we, who is, if you like, an activated civil society. I think we, in the end, I'm going to come out and say what I think. I think we is an activated, politicized civil society is who we is. And it's anyone we can get involved. So it's clearly everyone at this conference. And I think we have to insist that our politicians take this stuff seriously, because politicians need votes and we vote for them. So, you know, we're lucky enough in sort of democratic societies to at least have that theoretical possibility, although in America, they're clearly busy trying to remove it. And we also have to vote with our, you know, money. We have to send, every time you eat, every time you buy food, you are literally physically changing the world. So we have to eat well, which means not giving our money to the big corporations to the greatest extent it's possible for us, and to, you know, to buy from, you know, producers we know and trust, who farm regeneratively, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I'm not saying that's enough, you know, because we need our politicians to get involved, and we need them actually to address, to face up to the fact that, you know, they can't just let food companies make profit out of destroying the world. So, but it's up to us to insist that this becomes, that politicians get involved in food again, and that food companies are made to pay. So polluter pays, for example, would be one. So I'm literally going to spend the rest of the time. Polluter pays, for example. So internalizing the cost of food, which is what I'm proposing. is a matter of taxation. It's a matter of saying, if farmers have all sorts of runoff, you know, and all of their kind of excess fertilizer is going into lakes and destroying lakes, then they have to pay for that. And, you know, and all of these kinds of things. There are many, many mechanisms that can be brought in, but we have to get active on this and get political on this. So civil society is ultimately we, all of us.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay, we have another question from Hart Fewer. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, I loved your overview of the history of the city's embeddedness into agricultural landscapes. It seems like history has given us quite many rich examples to reflect on in that sense. And clearly some of these models are gone, as Jared Diamond has argued, because they had maybe poor environmental performance. But I wonder if some of these ancient landscapes, including some that you presented and maybe some that you didn't get a chance to, can really still teach us something. I mean, to what extent are some of the futurist models that you presented actually anchored in some good old ideas?
I think thank you very much for that, Hart. I mean, I think all the best ideas are ancient. You know, I mean, it's quite interesting that, you know, as you say, I mean, we've been kind of addressing this question now for thousands of years. And to me, I mean, the reason I find it very interesting, I talk about the sort of you know, the geographical age and then the post-geographical age and then the neo-geographical age, is that I think, you know, what the Industrial Revolution represents is, you know, something like 250 years when we thought we kind of could escape nature, you know, and we had this mindset of, oh, just chuck chemicals on it, or just burn it, or just, you know, whatever, use it. And now we're going, oh, you know, we can't do it like this. But the brilliant thing is that pretty much anything that the people did, you know, kind of pre-1700, there are lessons in it. I mean, there are good and bad lessons. So, for example, Rome is a really early example of what not to do. But we've kind of got the beginning, middle, and end of the Roman story. So we can actually, I mean, very much as you say with Jared Diamond, you can kind of look at it and go, that's where they went wrong. You know, but you can also say, well, we're doing the same thing. So how can we not take the same road? You know, I think we're very much at that point. I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at Rome, for example, which I find so instructive, there were people when basically Egypt was conquered, which was the real game changer for Rome, because basically that was like, I mean, the equivalent of us kind of, you know, turning the American Midwest into a grain production region. It's a very similar moment, you know, because it suddenly is like, oh, well, we've just solved the problem forever. Of course, there is no forever in civilization. But, you know, Roman poets were kind of saying, this is amoral. You know, Rome used to feed itself. It used to produce its own grain, and we used to import roses from Egypt. And now all we produce is roses, and we get all our grain from Egypt, you know, and you can see it happening, the unease that, oh, this isn't quite right. So I think, you know, what we can do is we can look back to models where, I mean, the reason I'm really interested in the city-state model, I mean, it's not that I think that cities have to look like fried eggs, or what I call the fried egg model, which is that, you know, you have a blob of urbanity surrounded by countryside, which is what the cartoon of it looks like. It's not that, but I do think that as political animals, we need, you know, we need society and nature. So I think looking at examples from the past where that was recognized is really instructive, and you can find them right the way back. I mean, it's really interesting. When I was researching my book, I ended up sort of discovering the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is really the sort of the first, is kind of the first narrative ever written. You know, it was written in the city of Uruk, which is just up the road from Ur, which I showed you. So it's very, very early, something like, you know, 3,000 years BC or something. And the story is about a king, the king of Uruk, who's behaving really badly, and he's treating all his people like slaves, and he's insisting on having sex with all the women before they get married. It's just generally awful. And the people complain to the gods, and the gods say, we need to make a natural opposite of Gilgamesh. And they make this kind of creature of nature called Eridu, who is identical to Gilgamesh, except he's literally of nature. You know, he's kind of got leaves for hair, and he's kind of made of grass, and he runs with the animals and so on. and Eridu comes and meets Gilgamesh, and there's a kind of, they fight, and then they become friends. And then there's a whole, I mean, I won't tell you the whole epic of Gilgamesh, but it ends up being a kind of meditation on our human need for balance with nature, which is just remarkable. So I think that's the biggest thing I take away. And I think, you know, an important thing to say is that this can happen at any scale. You know, so I guess my vision for Sitopia is a world in which all of us have access to society. Now, the internet's obviously a game changer in that respect, because, you know, before, you know, 20 years ago, you couldn't just literally sit in the middle of nowhere and have a conversation with somebody thousands of miles away. So that's remarkable. But we also need access to nature. And I think that's something that COVID really demonstrated, is that, you know, people who were cooped up in little urban flats with no access to outside space really went crazy. And so that's symptomatic to me of a deeper need. So I imagine this landscape, which is very much like the Lorenzetti landscape. It's very much, you know, it's based on oikonomia. I mean, the reason I show you all of these historic models is that I think there's great wisdom in them. And I think we need to think along those lines again and value food again, which again is an ancient idea. I mean, you know, if you told somebody in the 15th century that we would treat food as something cheap and expendable, they would have looked at you as if you were totally mad. So it's about at every scale. So that could be growing herbs on your windowsill. It could be a little balcony. It can be, if you're a designer, designing, you know, neighborhoods in cities where there's lots of space for nature. I mean, not just growing food, but also for, you know, water runoff. I mean, you know, we have to make our cities sponges again, as we're discovering with all of these floods, and so on and so on. So it's just a kind of a rethinking of what it means as a human to be part of a flourishing landscape that it includes humans and non-humans, would be my takeaway.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. We have another question in the chat box. Vesna Milicic is asking, in what way do you think will climate change shape our food systems in the future? Do you think we will be living in the world of farm factories, indoor farming, smart orchards, etc.? How do you see our world of food in 50 years' time? Thank you for the brilliant lecture.
Well, thank you for the brilliant question. I mean, I think, funnily enough, I was at a conference a few years ago and there was a kind of futurist there, you know, someone who can see into the future, which of course nobody can. And, but he was actually quite smart. And what he actually said was, well, I can see various trends in the food world. You know, he said people want more convenient food. They want it faster. They want it cheaper. They want it 24 hours. Blah. And he said, and I can also see a series of equal and opposite trends. So people want better provenance. They want to know who grew their food. They want to take more care over it. They want to do their own pickling, blah, blah, blah. So it's literally equal and opposite. And to be honest, I'm just going to take a leaf out of that futurist book and say, I think we're going to have both, because we've already got both, you know, so we've got some kind of, shall I say, technical obsessives who really think we can solve the food problem by, as you rightly say, teching our way out of the problem. And, you know, some of those ideas to me are incredibly exciting. So I don't know whether you've seen in Finland, for example, there's a factory that's actually worked out how to kind of produce protein out of sunlight, you know, using some fermentation process and bacteria that frankly is beyond my biological capacity to explain. But, you know, fantastic, brilliant, you know, so that would be wonderful. We can use that, and then maybe we can use that to feed it to fish, you know, in an aquaponic system or something. I have no issue with that at all. What I do have an issue with is, if you like, the kind of the fake meat thing that's happening at the moment. And it worries me because it's playing on this deep, as I said, we are actually programmed to desire meat. We are meat-eating animals. You just have to look at our teeth, you know, we like rich, you know, energy-giving food. And so, I mean, the meat question is a huge one. And I'm not against, by the way, trying to solve it technically, but what I'm against is the fact that, you know, the people who are doing this tend to be huge corporations who very, very quickly become the new Monsanto or the new whatever. They're very dominant. They're very kind of American, you know, and very sort of, you know, we are going to solve your problems, we are going to feed you, sort of thing. And actually, if you look at the ingredients in something like an Impossible Burger, you do not want to be eating this more than once, shall we say, a month. You know, I mean, it's highly processed food, which is now being recognized, only now is being recognized as the greatest threat to human health, is highly processed food, because it just totally messes with our digestive system. So it's not sugar, it's not fat, it's not all salt, it's not all the other things that have always been blamed. It's processing. So I don't particularly want to eat an Impossible. I mean, I've eaten, I mean, something similar, and it was delicious, but it had masses of coconut oil in it, which is basically the highest saturated fat on the planet. It's not nearly as nutritionally good as the real thing. You know, I'd rather eat much less meat, but eat meat that's, as I say, actual meat from a grass-fed animal that's being grown in a regenerative system that, you know, is really good for me and is really good for the planet, and just reduce the amount I eat. So, but again, I'm not saying that technical solutions are bad. I'm just saying we need to sort of see them in a balanced way and always ask the bigger question, you know, who's profiting from this? Is it good for our health? Is it good for the planet's health? Is it actually leading towards a better life for more people? And I'm worried that the fake meat thing's just turning into, I mean, all the big meat producers, by the way, are getting into it. It's just becoming the next big, you know, destructive. Oh, and the other thing, by the way, is, you know, just to say, well, while I have your attention, you know, it's very important with food not to allow yourself to be sort of, to fall into these kind of easy polarities. So, you know, meat bad, vegetables good. There's rubbish. You know, there's some very good meat and there's some very bad vegetables. You know, for example, almonds, you know, grown in California at the moment are part of a sort of a, you know, an ongoing ecological catastrophe, for example. So you have to, you know, you have to just be a little bit more, kind of go a little bit beyond the, you know, what the headlines tell you. But you know, the short answer to your question is, I think we're going to have more regenerative farming, and we're going to have more vertical farming, factory stuff, and we have to navigate our way through that, which is admittedly quite challenging. But you know, it's an interesting world to get into and to think about, and also, as I say, to get politicized about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. Vesna says, the future is about balance, Carolyn. Thank you very much.
Yeah, perfect. Well said, Vesna. I should have, yeah, that's a perfect summary. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we have time perhaps for one more question, if somebody wants to raise their hand. The audience is quite shy. I was thinking that once you're hiding behind this black square, you would be more courageous to. Okay, maybe I can ask the final one if nobody else. I don't think we have any. Okay. I was thinking, yeah, kind of you're returning all the time to processed foods and to overconsumption.
Yeah.
So how to address those?
Well, I mean, again, you know, I mean, governments have to get involved in food. They've been sitting on their hands for a century or more than a century. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all the studies. America is an obesogenic society, which basically means living there makes you fat, because you are bombarded day and night with food adverts. And I mean, every time I go to America, I put on so I was going to say half a stone, but you probably don't know what that is. You know, I put on 3-4 kilos because, you know, you order a sandwich and it's that big, you know, and I actually had a weird conversation with someone in an airport in Chicago a few years ago, because literally that happened to me. I ordered a sandwich and he started literally carving up half a loaf of bread. And I said, you know, there's not 6 of me, it's just 1 of me. Can I just have that, you know, enough for me to actually eat? And he said, no, that's the smallest size we do. So I was being force fed. And that's just insane. So, but that is, I mean, there's a brilliant book by a writer, and she's actually, it's written about 20 years ago now, called Food Politics by Marion Nestle, which is spelt like Nestle, but without the E on the end. And she pointed out that in America, and America, by the way, is where all of this modern food industry stuff actually got invented, which is why I talk a lot about America, and is also why America is, you know, the most the fattest nation on earth and the most undernourished and blah, 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 blah. Where do you stop? But anyway, she said in America every day, 5,000 calories of food are created for every man, woman, other genders, and children and babies. You know, every living human in America, there is 5,000 calories of food available to them. Now, as you know, you can only really eat about 2.2 thousand calories a day and be healthy. But in order to make money, the food industry has to somehow force some of that other 2.8 thousand calories down you. And that's where you get the buy 2 for 1, mega size, you know, super size, you know, all of this stuff. So this is insane. But the only way that's going to stop is with government intervention. And of course, as we know, in America, we have all these kind of ideas about, I mean, by the way, when I say in America, this is going global, which is why I show my hamburger world slide. And it's totally happening in the UK as well, and I'm sure elsewhere. I mean, I'd be interested to know whether it's happening where you are as well. But, you know, this kind of, you know, when the food industry takes over, its motive is profit. You know, and we are hunter-gatherers still. So we are programmed to want to eat salt, sugar, and fat, which never come together in nature, by the way. You know, so I mean, this is why hunter-gatherers will risk their life for honey, because honeycomb actually is the nearest thing in nature that you get to a food that's got kind of fat and sugar together. And, you know, it's we just can't resist it. So of course that's what the food industry tries to feed us, because we can't resist it. You know, and so we spend lots of money, we eat more than we should. And so the only way this is going to be addressed is by government intervention, I'm afraid, because we are programmed to eat. And I mean, with the best will in the world, you know, if you're literally bombarded every day with Krispy Kreme donut adverts, you're going to end up eating them.
Yeah, I agree. Yesterday, I ordered a Beyond Burger from Larsen Swen's. Oh. And I got the Beyond Burger, but I got also a chocolate, fries, and water in the plastic can that I didn't order. Yeah. And I realized at that moment that, okay, when I'm ordering like those healthy vegan bowls, I never get that. Yeah. You know? So this is exactly the problem behind it. Yeah.
So interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so as I said, I mean, going back to the brilliant earlier question about who is we, you know, we is you and me, Andrea, and everyone else listening in this conference. Just, you know, get informed, get political, write to your MP, buy the good stuff, don't buy the Beyond Burgers. I mean, you know, have one a month by all means, but, you know, sort of
3 per year I have.
3 a year, okay, yeah. Fine. But, you know, I mean, just you know, go to where give your food cash and your food love and your food interest to the people who are producing it right. And you can imagine being part of a future vision that you want to be part of too. And for me, that's often small scale and locally based and often very traditional and all of that stuff, you know. And as I say, I mean, I have a kind of bigger vision in a way of what the world might look like in 50 years' time. And, you know, for me, what I would love to imagine we would see is a lot more regenerative farming, a lot more kind of a much more inhabited countryside again, and much more kind of neighborhood life. And I think that's something that could, and it already is happening out of COVID, and with political vision could be really encouraged.
Yeah. Okay, we have to wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Carolyn. Thank you for everybody who attended this amazing lecture. And yes,